Iran has hosted the presidents of Turkey and Russia for the Astana process for Syria, which the Syrian foreign minister was then hosted by Iran a day later. One of the issues which was discussed, Turkey's possible military operation in northern Syria. Iran has voiced concern, with Iran's leader advising Turkey's presidents not to launch a new military operation. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at whether Turkey will go ahead with this or not, and look at Syria's security situation, possible cooperation with Iran and Russia on combating terrorism, why Turkey has said that the U.S. feeds terrorist organizations and must leave east of the Euphrates in Syria. Our guests for this edition of The Spotlight are Jim Kavanagh joins us. He's a founder of the polemicist.net, joins us from New York. Also joining us is Tony Gosling, who's an investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol over in the UK. Welcome to you both. Tony Gosling, let me first start with you. You have the Iranian foreign minister who has expressed concern regarding this potential Turkish, some call it an invasion, some call it a military operation in Syria, northern part of that country, which Ankara might undertake under the pretext of fighting terrorists, of which it has said that it will do. How concerning is this situation in which Turkey wants to possibly go through with it, at this point anyways?
Well, look, before I answer that question, I think it's important to point out that these are real talks going on, because I think what many countries have now realised, particularly those involved in these Middle East conflicts, is that in order to actually make any progress, the British and the Americans, and to a large extent the European Union, have to be out of the room, because there really has been no progress in talks almost whatsoever with any of these power blocs who, I mean, to be frank with you, the British Empire went at the end of the Second World War. The Americans tried to take over, but they still cannot actually face the fact that the empire is crumbling, and everything that they're doing is in an attempt to re-establish or to stop these empire aims from disappearing. So you've got to have the Americans out of the room if you're going to make any progress. So that's the reasons why I think we've got these three powers, even though of course Turkey is a NATO power, sitting down to have real conversations and real talks about how each of those countries, each of those factions what happens in these situations. This is a bit of horse trading. The Turks will be saying, well, we want this, we want that, and the Russians will be saying, etc. And all the various parties will be having their say on Syria. And at the end of the talks, what we may well find is that some compromises have been made during those talks. Now, coming to your question, so at least we've got that as a prospect, which when you're in talks with the British and the Americans, that's very, very rarely the case. The diplomatic aspect of it is basically out of the door. The diplomats' hands are tied. But I think, there will be some sort of progress on this, I would imagine, particularly because the Russians are in the room. Obviously, the Russians have got a big stake in Syria. Russia was largely the reason why the US empire failed in its attempt to overthrow President Assad. Main reason for that being the Tartus port, which is so crucial to projecting Russian military stabilizing power in the Mediterranean. And of course, we can't have a Mediterranean which is dominated by the Sixth Fleet and by NATO. That would be a disaster for many of the countries which rely on the balance of power being maintained in that part of the world. There's also the absolutely extraordinary situation of turning back ISIS and these proxy forces, mercenaries paid by the West and by NATO. Dilyana Gatasheva, the investigative journalist, has proven that the arms that were going to ISIS were coming from the United States. They were just using fake end-use certificates. So this was an amazing success, really, in stopping the regime change in Syria over the last decade or so. Very, very concerted attempt by the Americans. And it's actually, in a way, it's comparable to something like the Battle of Stalingrad in the Second World War, where the Russians turned back the assault on their country, the Soviet Union, by the Nazis. Or even if you go back further to biblical times, Paul's conversion from Saul in Acts 9 in the Bible, on the road to Damascus, this massive conversion and this complete change in this individual who was persecuting the early Christians and turned around and then became one of their biggest advocates, and of course wrote large parts of the New Testament after it. So it was an enormous turnaround in Syria, and so it's absolutely right to keep those people who were trying to institute regime change in Syria out of this, and to slowly bring the Turks on side, I suppose prize them away from the NATO alliance, and to bring about some peace here through some real horse trading with these three main powers.
Sure. Well, Jim Kavanagh, our guest there, has opened up a topic there that is worth asking you then, the question of which, in the format of the Astana process, you have the Russian presidents, you have the Turkish president, and obviously the Iranian president, Iran being the host, of which you're having a diplomacy work there in terms of working out things, wherein if you did have the U.S. or the British in the room, that things would not be at all going in a direction where there'd be any type of result. And maybe at the same time, in the same breath, I may ask you if you make a comparison to the way that the U.S. president visited West Asia or Middle East, as they call it, and not coming out with anything. At least here, you're having some tangible progress. You're having these leaders, the presidents meet Iran's leader. You're having an exchange of thoughts, and you're reaching some kind of direction as to where things may go. Is it appropriate to view it that way? Of course, I'd like to thank Tony Gosling for that perspective.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree that it's much more likely to be productive without the Americans and the British in the room. And, you know, you have the principals in this case, who are all serious people, and none of them are the kinds of poodles that the Europeans are to American imperialism. And so that's an important issue, and that opens up a possibility. What you do have is, first of all, let's make clear the Americans are still in the background on this. The Americans occupy a third of Syrian territory. They occupy oil fields and grain and agricultural fields that are very important. And they haven't given up on their regime change target yet, but clearly that's not going to happen probably. And what they have been doing is preventing Syria from reconstructing, and they're going to continue to do that as long as they can. On the other hand, in terms of the principles in Astana, you have Erdogan, who is a smart cookie, and he works for himself, and he plays all sides. And look what he just did with NATO, So he is going to, and he has, on the backs of the Americans, and he came in and occupied part of Syrian territory. He's not going to give that up easily. Syria at some point, and the Russians, backed by the Russians, are going to have to decide what they're going to do about the American occupation, what they're going to do about the Turkish occupation. Now, as Tony said, this kind of negotiation with these principles might come to some conclusion on that. But everybody now, I'm very suspicious, because look at what Erdogan has done with NATO. With all the attention and all the cats away in Ukraine, the mice can play in Syria, and I don't know what Erdogan is going to insist on, or what Assad is going to insist on. He wants his territory back. He should have it. And what would he give to get Turkey out of it? What would Turkey take to get out of his territory? It's a tricky situation, but it's one which is kind of, for the moment, with the Astana process, has some possibilities of resolution, because it's put the imperial masters to the side, at least for the moment and directly.
Well, it looks like there's a common goal here, Tony Gosling. Correct me if I'm wrong. When you have Turkey, that even after meeting Iran's leader, who said that this military incursion that you're going to make or take is not a good idea, it's actually going to help the terrorists, and it's going to create instability. Meanwhile, Turkey has said, you know what, I need you, Russia and Iran, to support this Turkish operation in Syria, with the common goal that we want to eliminate terrorists. Now, Turkey views the YPG militia as terrorists. Okay, so are we seeing that there may be some cooperation there in order to stop Turkey, as it has been stated, to want to carve out that slice of northern Syria, when Russia and Iran will come into the picture and aid Turkey in terrorist operations, if Russia and Iran, that is, decide to do so?
Well, they may well do so. And I think this is the steely test of these diplomats. They're able at these talks to actually do their job, as diplomats are actually very well trained to do it. Their hands are totally tied if they're British diplomats or US diplomats. But I think there's every possibility that we will see some sort of deal come out of this. It benefits everybody to reduce tensions. It benefits the Turks, it benefits the Syrians, benefits the Russians and Iran. All powers in the region would be really happy to see less and less tension, less and less of the idea of sort of picking up arms, trying to grab more territory. And of course, one of the reasons that the Turks have been taking territory and the YPG have is as a bargaining chip. So this is where those bargaining chips come down on the casino table today. This is what they're there for. So they will be making concessions. I do believe that they're not simply there to steamroller through their views and ignore everybody else like the British and the Americans do in their talks. And in the background to this, we've got a much more confident Russia. Very important to see that the Russians now, I see Sergei Lavrov is now saying that the objectives in Ukraine are beyond the Donbass. So they've changed their tune a bit. They said they wanted to liberate the Donbass, and they're now saying, well, actually, it may be more than that. And of course, the Russians may not want more than that, but they're confident enough to say that they do want more than that in order to force Zelensky and the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. So that's the sort of thing the Russians, I think, are showing an example to the world here. What they're doing is they're saying, come to the table, come to the negotiating table. The West, the Americans, the British have refused to do that time and time again. I think with every possibility that we may see changed borders ultimately in Syria, new lines drawn, but those negotiations are taking place now, and they're very real negotiations that may become let's not forget the actual Syrian people themselves. They want this over with. They want to return to a normal, peaceful life, and they may be able to get that if things go well at these talks.
Well, Jim Kavanagh, so at least, when it comes to Syria, we know what Russia wants, we know what Iran wants, and also we know the Turkish aim. Do we know what the U.S. wants? What is it doing in Syria?
Oh, it wants to keep, as I said, it wants to keep Syria from reconstruction. It wants to keep the Syrian government and society from unifying and from building itself up again. And it wants to keep Syria weak, and it wanted to topple the government of Syria. It wanted to destroy the state. It didn't get away with that because the Russians intervened and interrupted it, although it's not over yet. And they are going to play the game. They're going to try and play Erdogan themselves in a certain way. I'm not as optimistic about Erdogan, and I don't know what the Turks want. I wouldn't say that. I think it would be on the table right away. The Russians and the Iranians will say to the Turks, "Oh, we'll keep down. We'll prevent the YPG from organizing and mobilizing, and we disarm them, etc. If you leave the territory." I don't know that Erdogan actually wants to leave. And I don't know that the Americans might be saying to Erdogan, we might sit here and say, well, the Russians are showing their strength, but the Russians are also involved. They're occupied. They have things to do in Ukraine. And the Americans might be saying to the Turks, and Erdogan might be saying to himself, well, I can make moves now, and the Russians may not have really want to get involved in something right here at this time while they're still not finished in Ukraine. So all of these variables are out there, and they make for a very interesting situation. And unfortunately, the victim in this is Syria, which is divided, which is occupied by various countries and we don't have a clear sense of how that's going to end in a way that restores the territorial integrity and the unity of Syria and allows it to rebuild in a strong way. Iran wants that. Russia wants that. I don't know that Erdogan wants that, and the Americans certainly don't.
Well, Tony Gosling, so this is what Erdogan has said. He came out and said the U.S. feeds terrorist organizations and must leave east of the Euphrates in Syria. Obviously, he's talking about the U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters. So, in a sense, why doesn't Turkey address this issue with the U.S. and for the U.S. to make up its mind if it is tiptoeing the line of whether it's going to support Turkey or it's going to support these the Kurds that they used so much in the war against Syria?
Well, look, that's a great question, a really good question. And of course, what the answer to it is that the Americans are still using these terrorists as leverage in Turkey. Turkey's in I think, a really unenviable position, being right in the middle of all of this between East and West, in the enormous tensions that there's been between the old Soviet, the Russians, and well, they were Soviets, they're not anymore, the Russians and the West, including, of course, some of the ex-Soviet states in the West, and the Russian and American tensions in the Middle East. The Turks are right in the middle, and I think they are trying to play a game where they can play one off against each other, and I'm not sure that they're going to win that game. It seems pretty clear to me that you've got much bigger potential battles going on around the world. Just take a look at what's been happening in Taiwan. Between China and the US. The US seems to want to pick a fight with everybody, and the Turks, I think, have really got to make their mind up which side they're on. Of course, there is an attempt to harden the sides in these big international conflicts. The military use that terminology when they're preparing for a war. They don't want independent states, certainly not big ones like Turkey. So they really need to try to get the Turks on board with their plans for the Middle East, and also, of course, their plans to fight in Ukraine, which the Turks have not been so enthusiastic about. So you've got to see this in the wider context of the enormous tensions with Taiwan, with the Americans sailing a destroyer down through the Taiwan Straits and really annoying the Chinese. Now, of course, the problem with what's been going on in Ukraine in the background is that this has given the Chinese confidence. The Chinese are looking at the Russians and saying, well, if Russia could do this in the Donbass, maybe we can do this in Taiwan. And that could potentially be disastrous. The Americans have said anything that happens in Taiwan, we're going to go all out to liberate it. So you've got the potential of a fuel of a much bigger, wider war between China and the US. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I think we need to bear these things in mind when we're talking about what Syria is now, a minor conflict. And if there was a wider war, there would be a big focus, I think, on the core of that would be this tension between Israel and Iran. And that's why it's so important to get Syria straightened out and these nations in the Middle East much more stable. Otherwise, that becomes a powder keg for the sort of core of this potential World War III between Iran and Israel, which that I think would become a much bigger problem in the future. So I'm not trying to prophesy here, predict the future, but I think we need to bear these much bigger plans that I believe the United States has, because they are not going to just release their empire just like that. They want to, I think, use their military power before they go down, and we need to try and keep them in the box. And that's exactly what the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians are doing, talking about Syria today. Very important, and it'd be nice to see much more going on the wider sphere between the Americans, and the Americans are the big players in Ukraine, talking to the Russians. We need to have these talks, otherwise we're going to see I think potentially wider conflicts taking place that will dwarf what happened in Syria, and we really don't want that.
Well, Jim Kavanagh, I'm still trying to get an answer on as to why the U.S. is in Syria. You gave some explanations there. There are other sides to the story behind the U.S. presence. One of them is the fact that the U.S. is aiding and abetting terrorists. Russia has come out and said that in and around that area that they're in, and they're moving actually troops interchangeably between Syria and Iraq. Because Iran has said if the U.S. withdraws itself from that area, then there is going to be a move towards stability. Then there will be a move towards this calming down. So in that regards, how do you see that happening? I mean, what do you see as chances of that happening? Or are we still looking at a prolonged presence? Because again, it goes back to the question, what does the U.S. gain here?
Oh, I think there's very little chance of that happening from the U.S. in terms of the U.S. presence. The United States is going to stay there as long as it can. Look, the reason the United States went into Syria and wants to disrupt Syria and destroy the Syrian state is the same reason it wanted to destroy Libya and Iraq. It's the neocon program for destroying all the resistance states against Israel, and Syria was the stepping stone towards Iran. That was always the case. That was explicitly said, and it still is the case. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that not only the Americans and the Turks, but the Israelis are bombing Syria every week, a couple of times a week. There's a military attack going on in Syria. There's military occupation of the country and a military attack. And from the Obama administration, when they signed when Israel and the United States signed a secret agreement, essentially setting up a war council against Iran, that has been the program. So there's no question that the American game in Syria is part of the American game, the Israeli-driven American game against Iran. And we are in a situation, I think, the JCPOA negotiations are failing, and I think that we're in a situation, Israel wants an attack on Iran, and they want to create a situation in an area in which that can happen, and they can get away with it, and they need the Americans to go along with it. So that's got to be put into our thinking about this, because that is the reason the Americans went into Syria, and
sure.
Because Syria was not doing anything to the United States. They were cooperating with the United States in a lot of ways, but they were part of the resistance axis
sure.
against Israel.
That 9 years of it, Tony Gosling, 9 years of a war in Syria, 9 years of the U.S. and its allies trying to get rid of their obsession with Assad, it didn't work. So I'm not too sure what track record the U.S. has to even want to think about pursuing that goal. And at the same time, we're looking at a different Russia. Our guest there talks about how Israel attacks Syria every other week. Well, at this point, Russia is sanctioned off by the West. Israel, by default, has now gone along with the West when it comes to Russia because, obviously, of what it's doing in Ukraine. So Russia has issued a few warnings to Israel about not attacking Syria. Are we looking at the possibility of the warnings turning into action by Russia when it comes to Israel attacking Syria?
Well, the obvious thing to do would be to shoot down an Israeli jet, wouldn't it? That's the obvious thing to do. That may happen. We shall see, particularly since the Russian S-400 system is pretty efficient at doing that kind of thing. So, I think that could happen at any time. I agree with Jim as well that we just heard there. That this is really about Israel. That's why the Americans are there. They're doing it for Israel, and they've got a rather frightening Christian Zionist faction in the United States, an enormous faction that believes that what the Israelis do is God's will. This is quite frightening, with pastors like Hagee and others that believe that what Israel does is somehow, this is always going to be the right thing, that they can do no wrong. Now, this is also a very worrying faction. That is to say, the twisting and misuse of the Christian and other religions in these conflicts. And that's why I think we need to be a very close eye on the Middle East and how various religions are being used and twisted in order to try and exacerbate Middle East conflicts.
Thank you. Sorry to jump in, Tony Gosling, fresh out of time, investigative journalist. Jim Kavanagh, thank you, founder of the polemicist.net. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from Mikhail and the team. It's goodbye until next time.